Technology wins. So when does the clock officially start? Here we go. Have you ever been through or are in a testing experience or trial where you wonder, where is God in all this? Have you ever been in a situation where things are so upside down that it becomes a hard test of your faith? These are, of course, rhetorical questions. We've all been through these types of situations. The hardest are the ones where we see no purpose at the moment. We just keep putting one foot in front of the other and carry on, believing that God is in the moment and he will achieve what he wants to achieve. But sometimes, when we least expect it, things resolve miraculously. Everything comes together and we experience relief and often understanding. We learn patience from these experiences, and we learn, however painful and perplexing or difficult, to wait for the miracle. That, of course, is the title of today's message, and we'll see some examples today from history and from the Bible. The first is from history and involves a U.S. president with whom you're very familiar. In his first term, this president faced sore and difficult trials of every magnitude. His predecessor left several things undone and unaddressed, leaving numerous ethical, workforce, economic, and even global issues to be resolved. When he first announced his candidacy, he was not popularly received. His prior political career was pockmarked with ups and downs. His speaking style was openly mocked. And when the presidential nominating convention rolled around, he was considered a compromise candidate. Probably a one-term caretaker president to get through a crisis if he got elected. Now, in his fourth year in running for re-election, his popularity was very low. His advisors told him he didn't stand much of a chance. The populist positions of his opponent had much higher appeal at the time to voters. But he never gave up, even though thousands of people were pushing him to quit and someone take his place on the ticket. He never gave up, even though insulting and demeaning images and sick jokes regularly appeared about him in mainstream media. He never gave up, even though the position of his opponent was far more popular. And then, miraculously, everything changed. And when it changed, it didn't just change for the president, it changed for the world. And it changed in ways that directly affect you today. What am I talking about? The president regarded today as possibly the greatest U.S. president of all time, the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. 7 months before the 1864 election, most people thought Lincoln was going to be soundly defeated by his former commanding general, George McClellan, who was running as a Democrat. Multiple thousands of Union soldiers, some 620,000 soldiers, had died, and others had returned home gruesomely maimed. People were tired of the war. They wanted Lincoln out. McClellan had promised that he would end the war and that he would negotiate a peace with Jefferson Davis and the Confederate States of America, even if it meant recognizing the end of the former United States of America. If that had happened, can you imagine, and it almost did, can you imagine what the world would look like today? There would have been no powerful United States of America to intervene in World War I or World War II or in peacekeeping missions around the world. But on September 1st, 1864, news came, and the first of many Union victories came, and with it, the surge of popularity for Lincoln. He was subsequently reelected by a huge margin. People began to see what a great president he was and how he had tirelessly stood for sound principles. The miracle was unfolding. During this time, Lincoln had been quietly studying and examining how one could discern the will of God. He believed that God had a plan that involved the United States but that neither side fully understood it. He privately wrote a remarkable document titled Meditation on the Divine Will, which was discovered after his death. He decided to tell the people his thoughts and beliefs in his second inaugural address, which was delivered 159 years ago this past Monday. Instead of writing a speech that boasted of his strong leadership, he delivered remarkable thoughts about God. On March 4th, 1865, the sun broke through on a stormy inauguration morning, moments before Lincoln spoke. To the festive attendees' great surprise, he called out both sides of the conflict. I would like to highlight a few intense sections of that speech. It is the only presidential inauguration speech that openly quotes Scripture several times. What does that say for us today? In briefly tracing the progress of the war, Lincoln acknowledged that neither side had wanted the deadly conflict, but both had made serious mistakes. He said, simply and profoundly, and the war came. Continuing on, Lincoln went straight to the point. Quote, both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God. Each evokes God's name against the other. Referencing Genesis 3, verse 19, Matthew 7, verse 1, and Luke 17, verse 1, he said, it may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both, he said, could not be answered. That of neither, he also emphasized, has been answered fully. Then he makes a key point, which relates and makes the central point of our message today. The Almighty, he told his congregation and his people assembled before him, has his own purposes. He continued, directly quoting Psalm 19, verse 9. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. It was a miracle speech. It was unlike any other speech ever delivered by a United States president in any form. The speech concludes with its famous ending by paraphrasing Psalm 147, verse 3, and James 1, verse 27. With malice towards none, he told everyone, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. 41 days later, while watching a play with his wife leaning against him and tenderly holding his hand, he was assassinated by a Southern sympathizer. When Lincoln died a few hours later, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton said, now he belongs to the ages. In his private meditations on God's will, Lincoln left us a profound thought to be considered as part of this miracle. He wrote, the will of God prevails. In great contests, such as the war they were in or whatever happens to be happening today or in the future, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. God cannot be for, Lincoln said, and against the same thing at the same time. In the present Civil War, he said, it is quite possible that God's purpose is somewhat different than the purpose of either party. A message for us, perhaps, today. Remember, in 1864, belief in God was something quite different than today. When Lincoln commented about both sides reading the same Bible, he wasn't indulging in rhetoric. After the Battle of Gettysburg, more than 6,000 bodies lay dead in the battlefield. In collecting personal items for relatives to later identified, what was the single most common item found on persons killed in that battle? Pocket copies of the Bible. Scholar Jane McPherson, who you know from Ken Burns' famous documentary, wrote, Civil War armies were arguably the most religious in American histories. In the 20th century, people argued about the nature and origin of the Bible. In the 19th century, in Lincoln's day, they believed it was the Word of God. People would have had more than a passing understanding what Lincoln was talking about in his inauguration. The takeaway here, over the war-torn 4 years as president, Lincoln came to new and profound beliefs about God. Those beliefs transcended the politics of the day and are preserved for us. If he had been defeated for re-election, as many thought, his presidency today would be viewed quite differently, and the world would be dramatically different. And instead of telling everyone how great he was, leading them through the war, he chose to tell everyone how the Almighty has his purposes, and that we need to be aligned with that divine will of God. From a president. Then, now immensely popular, his life and thoughts were sealed and elevated forever with his tragic assassination. Indeed, the Almighty has his own purposes. And regardless of our personal views, it must be said that the judgments of the Lord are indeed true and righteous altogether. A great miracle occurred on March 4th, 1865. The Union was preserved, which dramatically changed the course of history, including our lives today. That's the history part. To finish up over the next couple of minutes, let's turn to a profound biblical example of this in the 11th chapter of John, where people waited for an unexpected miracle. Here we'll see how disciples believed in God's purpose and held fast, even when they didn't understand it. I'm talking here, of course, about the resurrection of Lazarus, a pre-Passover story. It is important to note that during his life on earth, there were 3 people who Jesus openly loved and liked to be around: Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. As the Bible records, when Jesus was in his late 20s, early 30s, these 3 became favorite people in his life. These are key figures in more than one biblical story. John is careful to point out that Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus in John 11:6. So you can imagine what Jesus felt like when he learned that God's purpose was that these 3 people who he loved were going to have to suffer. They were going to have to suffer to prove a major point and demonstrate it. And further, that critical point would be punctuated and elevated with a death that caused great pain to both some of his favorite people and to the Jewish community. The story in John 11 opens with Jesus now saved from being assassinated himself. Lazarus falls ill with an unspecified disease, but one that is life-threatening. It is serious enough that the sisters send for help. Remember, Jesus has healed people with serious issues from afar. He's done this before, and they know it. But Jesus says and does something unusual here, especially for people that he personally cares for deeply. He remarks in verse 4 that this situation is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Then, instead of rushing back or healing from afar, the Bible records that Jesus deliberately, quote, stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was, as we read in verse 6. The Bible is silent, but you can imagine what was happening back in Bethany during this time. Lazarus continues to get increasingly worse. Martha and Mary know what Jesus is capable of. I suspect they wondered what God had in mind and what was the purpose of this rapidly unfolding trial that was getting drug out. Finally, Jesus announced that he and the disciples are going to return to Judea, where he was earlier nearly killed. The announcement is not well received by the disciples, and they try to talk him out of it. Jesus becomes supernaturally aware of what's going on in Bethany. He makes a remarkable statement that reinforces God's purpose in the outcome, which is essentially lost on the disciples. He says, Lazarus has died, and for your sake, I am glad I was not there. Why? So that you may believe. So as the story progresses, Jesus and his disciples go to Bethany, where they see the magnitude of the suffering. Make no mistake, a favorite person has died, probably in his youth, and people are grieving. Few, if anyone, are looking for a miracle. Then he arrives. Lazarus has been dead for some 90 plus hours, 4 days. There's no question that he's dead. When Martha greets Jesus, she expresses her faith but doesn't understand the purpose of it. Jesus quickly gets to the point in verse 25 of John 11. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? He asked Martha and us today. So if you've ever been in a trial or test that doesn't seem to make any sense, the next part is for you. When Mary comes out, obviously distraught, she expresses her dismay with Jesus in verse 32. She calls him out. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus knows what's trying to be taught here, but it is personally painful. He sees the deep suffering of his close friends. So the purpose of the Almighty can be met. He's in the moment and he's feeling it. The situation ramps up in verse 33 with a very powerful statement. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews had come to her also weeping, it says in verse 33, he was deeply moved in spirit and greatly troubled. The Greek word deeply moved in verse 33 and 38 is most unusual. It is translated, and I will attempt this, embramastathai. My apologies to you Greek scholars. And the 3 other times it is used in the New Testament, it is used to reflect sternness or anger, which does not match the content here or context. The Greek verb expresses a deep, profound reaction. As William Barclay writes, quote, here is one of the most precious things in the gospel. So deeply did Jesus enter into men's sorrow that his heart was wrung with anguish. This would have been a staggering and incredible picture. A God who cares. The inexpressible reaction and indescribable emotion explains the nature of the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. As the story climaxes, no one understands the purpose of God. No one is expecting a miracle, or at least few are. Lazarus, the one Jesus loved, is dead. Nothing will change that. People are starting to wonder openly that perhaps Jesus is not as powerful as they thought. Then everything changes. Still profoundly emotional, Jesus tells Martha in verse 40, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, the people in this room, the people within sound of my voice, the people yet to read this, that they may believe that you sent me. Now, at the peak of the experience, when nobody expects it, the miracle happens. The power and glory of Jesus' existence as the Messiah, the anointed one of God, who is the resurrection and the life, is intensely confirmed. When he had said these things, he cried out, Jesus, with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. This really happened. Have you ever been through or are in a testing experience or trial where you wonder, where is God in all this? Have you ever been in a situation where things were so upside down, it became a hard test of your faith? The Almighty has his purposes. Wait for the miracle.